Hello, 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 everybody. It is so good to see you guys today. We have an amazing guest today. ISLA MAC is with us. I'm going to bring her right in because she is here in the backstage area. And so why drag this out, right? So let's talk to Isla. Hi, Isla. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, Isla, I would love it if you would start off by telling the audience about yourself. Tell us a bit about your background.
Okay, I have a clinical background, so I was a a university lecturer, and I worked in HIV and sexual health. I my academic area was public health, and I taught global public health. So that's kind of essentially why I kind of got interested in the whole trans and gender ideology issue. Because obviously, it was I could see it was a big medical scandal going on.
Now, I prepped for this discussion by listening to your content.
Right.
And to say that it was distressing is an understatement because the thing about you is that you are someone who came from the education sector. So you were actually teaching future health professionals. And so you
Right.
were in a unique position to observe the sea change in the approach to medical education in the UK. So when did you notice that there was a change and what was that change?
So I was also chair of governors, school governors, in my kind of off time because I had children as a parent. And it was kind of a combination, really, of this kind of seepage. But by that time, I was doing less in the way of clinical work and more teaching. But I was spending quite a lot of time on Twitter, doing my kind of with my professional hat on. But I could see very much that there was more and more parents turning up every day, wondering what the hell was going on, and thought that because it actually takes quite an inordinate amount of time to research, because we've all had to become mini specialists, really, haven't we, about
Mhm.
learning all about medicine, epidemiology, public health, all these different facets. So I thought parents needed a bit of help to work out how they could work with their schools through their complaints process, because essentially right from the get-go, schools were being very hostile to parents and saying that they were essentially transphobic. Um, so I basically decided that there was a kind of hybrid needed. So yeah, I guess my channel is a little bit. I hope you weren't shocked, like in a bad way,
Mm-mm.
but that you could see, essentially we're at the point now where the medical establishment are ravaged, savaged. They've been completely and utterly captured, right across the board from all the different medical bodies, research bodies, research funding, through obviously people working at government level, policymakers. And the important things and why this is really relevant. And I think one of the things that you were interested in when you saw the talk that I did with Robbie and Barry, was
Mhm.
about the impact of that on clinical practice,
Mhm.
and that's certainly something maybe we can tease out a little bit if you'd like.
Mhm.
Um,
Look, all that I know is that when I read about there being over a 5,000% increase in young women showing up at those clinics, because you had pointed out that prior to whatever it was that triggered this interest in the trans movement and people identifying as trans, that it was really more young men and middle aged men who tended to attend these clinics. But all of a sudden, there was this explosion, a 5,300% increase in young women, many of whom were on the autism spectrum, and
mm,
among them, many of whom, as you put it, you said it, that they presented with comorbidities, whether it was
mm,
cutting, eating disorders, all of that. And look, I am not a statistician and I am not a medical professional, but I can tell you, well, maybe it's because I'm a journalist, if I saw that giant explosion in one particular group of people who were all of a sudden flocking to any kind of clinic for any kind of treatment, I would want to know why that is. And it seems like nobody has really taken an interest in that. And I find that pretty distressing, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it is wholly distressing, really, and I think that it's because of the level of capture that we've got to. What they've essentially tried to do is they've tried to completely and utterly deconstruct the idea that sex, biological essentialism, and introduce this concept of sex as a spectrum, and that we all have this innate gender identity, essentially. Which is basically built on an idea of regressive, gendered stereotypes, and that we all have this gender identity. But for in terms of healthcare, we have these multiple touch points in how that's impacted upon us all. Because obviously we've got women and single sex spaces, we've got the kind of healthcare issues, and that relates to trans people and their bodies. And the medical harms that are being committed against them, essentially. We've got the bigger funding issue. We've got the social hysteria from children, which is what you were talking about. And then we've got the intersection of how that then rolls into schools and young people and adolescents. I mean, maybe we can kind of start from the top and think about,
Sure.
Let's start from the kind of issue of, because I know one of the things that you were interested in was the story on the biological sex part, and how, the story that I mentioned about the kind of kidney failure. So let me maybe explain that first. Essentially what's happened is that within medicine and clinical practice, one's biology is absolutely fundamental so that we can give effective and safe medical care. And your heart, lungs, internal organs, don't change just because you stick bits on your body or fiddle with your hormones. And blood values are really, really incredibly important. And what we need to know whether you're a man or a woman, essentially. So the fact that what they've done is essentially gone into, because of the lobbying of the NHS, for an example, in the UK, they're now trying to erase the idea of sex, and they are supplementing that for gender identity. So in the case that I mentioned in the video that you were interested in, essentially what we had was this misdiagnosis, and this was actually a story which is taken from a very good friend of mine's book that she mentioned, called Born in the Wrong Body by Liskap Itliata. Isadora Sanger is her nom de plume, and I highly recommend this book to everyone. Essentially, a trans male, so a female, had some serious renal disease probably because of the high levels of testosterone she was on, and maybe some underlying issues. But she kept going along with her deteriorating kidney function, and obviously she had quite a slight body mass index because she was a female. Now, she kept being assessed by the blood values that related to a male-bodied person, so a man. So this meant that she was denied a life-saving kidney transplant for an extra year, because had she been assessed according to her female body, she would have gone straight onto the transplant list, because the values are different for men and for women. So she could have lost her life because of this. And by the time she did actually hit the transplant point, her body had deteriorated significantly, and she'd lost a lot of body mass. And she was, she could have died or rejected the organ. Luckily, I think she did survive. And this case was obviously written up in a medical journal. But this has not been done for them. This has been done by their request. And I'll tell you a couple of areas that this has become very relevant in. Blood products. So when we require a blood transfusion, it's always been very important for us to know whether you're getting blood being given to you from a male or a female. Now, because lobbyists have basically bullied the blood transfusion service into removing this sexed marker, there's now a potential that males will receive blood from females who've been pregnant in the past, and that now increases their risk of having serious transfusion reactions to them. So that's not a small issue, and there's absolutely no benefit to the blood transfusion service doing this, apart from to make people feel a little bit better while they're sitting in the room giving blood, you know, saying that we value your gender identity. But medically, you know, that's a dangerous thing.
Is it, you had mentioned in one of your videos that midwives were actually teaching their students that men can have babies, but you said biological men can have babies.
Well,
midwives are teaching students that biological men can have children.
We have this language slippage, don't we? But this happened at Napier University in Edinburgh. And I'm absolutely certain it's happening across the UK now. And again, this is because of this indoctrination and power that's been and the capitulation basically to lobby groups, which is a very serious issue. And we know that students are being punished if they don't put forward this incredibly scientifically inaccurate information within their essays. So if they don't use things like assigned at birth, they will be penalised. Now, that makes me incredibly infurious, because no one is assigned at birth. It's not a sorting hat. You know, we're accurately determined in utero, and then we're recorded at birth. But again, this is, you know, another lobbying issue. I mean, another area which is really important has been in public health screening. So obviously women are invited for cervical screening, and men for abdominal aortic aneurysm screening, as an example, when they're a bit older. Now, what's happened is that people who are assuming self-ID and a special gender identity are having their NHS records completely changed and having new NHS numbers and their biological sex deleted and their histories. And so they're then complaining that they're not being, so a trans man who's a woman is complaining that she's now not being invited for cervical screening, and a male who's a trans female, a trans woman rather, and I will clarify later that I actually hate all of these words with a passion. But basically, he's now been invited for a cervix screen that he doesn't possess a cervix. So you can see that how much of a massive a waste of time this is for the NHS, and B, a serious life-threatening issue were they to have had cancer that was completely missed. The other thing is that data, we need data, accurate data, because that's how funding for the NHS is worked out. You know, the way you get money in the UK for your services is accurate, to know accurate information about how many people you have of certain groups. So if you stop recording accurate sex data, then that all goes out the window. So you know, people will have seen this huge amount of time that we spend arguing in lawfare around sex and gender cases.
See, the thing is that for people who live in the United States, where we do not have medicine controlled centrally by the government, unless you're on Medicaid or Medicare, all of this sounds bizarre, okay? And a lot of people in the United States, a lot of the activists I've spoken to, have pushed back against me and said, well, who cares about the crime statistics? What difference does it make? If you have it down that a woman is being executed, a woman is on death row, a woman committed a rape, a woman committed a murder, whatever, and it's a trans woman, what difference does it make? Well, in the case of the NHS, we can see that it makes an enormous amount of difference. In a place where there are long waiting lists to get medical care, in a place where and I said this to my audience just the other day. Who is ultimately going to get screwed over? It's going to be women. When you start trudging men into a gynecologist's office to get a cervical screening, guess who doesn't get that appointment? And guess who is actually at risk for cervical cancer and other gynecological cancers? It's not the men who are being paraded in there. And so this to me, I mean, the thing that astonishes me about it, well, you yourself said in one of your videos that you are now talking to people who are doctors, who were junior doctors during the AIDS crisis, who are gay men, and they're totally on board with this insanity, you know? And it's sad to me. It's sad to me because you see a lot of members of the gay community who are pushing back very, very hard against this ideology because they see how it is impacting the gay community, not just in terms of the way that they're perceived, but also in very real terms. You know, when a lesbian is being told that she must have sex with an individual with a penis, or else be called a sexual racist by the lesbian who is running Stonewall, then you end up with a problem. But when you're talking about the NHS, I mean, it boggles the mind that it has happened as quickly as it has, because relatively speaking, it has happened very, very quickly.
It has been quick. You're right, and I think one of the things which is really upsetting, and is certainly something which is bringing more and more people into the movement, if you like, is the issue of language erasure. And I don't know how this affects you in the States, but certainly what we've got is this massive war over the body, where what happened was they went. Basically, what's happened, we are now cervix havers, we are chest feeders, period havers, menstruators, etc. We have front holes, and men have become, so they went from being trans women one word to trans women two words. Now they're just women, and now they're female, and now some of them are calling themselves adult human female. Whereas so if you look at a back-to-back campaign run by a massive cancer charity, for example, you'll have a prostate, the men's prostate cancer will call them men. So all the men's language is intact. But in the women's category, you'll have them erased. And this is important, not just because it's incredibly, we're being erased as a sex class, or we're being given a Derivation as we're being called cis, like we're a subcategory of our own sex class. Right. We also have to think about women, for example, who's for English, is their second language. And we also have a lot of survey evidence through research methods to say that many women do not actually know what a cervix is. So that's highly problematic by removing the word women, because, and this erosion has just sort of, essentially putting more and more women in jeopardy. And it's not ethical, because we're building thing upon thing here. Essentially, what we're now looking at is a kind of duty of care where privacy and dignity of women is also being erased because of the issue of people being able to opt into our sex class and self-ID. So if you think about staff, for example, I don't know what it's like in the US, but over here you could always ask for a female member of staff to do your cervical smear or a mammogram. And this was also always sort of basic safeguarding principle and essentially, a legal right, because we have always had these accommodation, single-sex spaces, wherever there was some area where women and girls were where nudity occurred in a public arena, in toilets, changing rooms, hospitals, schools, prisons, etc. But essentially, if we then see that men can now become women, and this is certainly something which is very problematic and on the agenda in every tweet today in terms of the Scottish government stuff that we can maybe talk about later. But in terms of single-sex wards, you've got staff now. Any male can now identify as a female, but also their women's right, therefore, to have a female is being taken away. And if you think about a paralyzed woman, an incapacitated woman, when we're talking about, someone in ITU, we're talking about very intimate things like, having your tampon changed, cleaning your vulva, doing catheter care. I mean, this is the ultimate issue of invasion of privacy, where dignity should be something which you are afforded. And obviously that's been erased. And that's then been built on in terms of the loss of single-sex wards within the NHS, because my fantasy in America is that you have a lot of cubicles because of your private healthcare, perhaps. I mean, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but we have open bays. We don't have a lot of side rooms, right? We only have a couple of side rooms maybe on each ward. And they are highly sought after across the country for infectious diseases. If you're, maybe if you were dying, you might be very lucky, but mostly it's for infectious diseases where you have to be barrier nursed. So what you now have is men on women's wards, and a number of policies have erased. One specific policy called Annex B came along and rode roughshod through this understanding that we had single-sex wards. And essentially what we've had is a number of rapes and sexual assaults happened, and women being gaslit. That there was this was talked about in the House of Lords. I don't know if you saw it on Twitter. Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne, she basically has been incredibly active at trying to get rid of Annex B. But a woman was raped, and what they said was no rape could have taken place because no man was on the ward. Right. And so her mental health deteriorated significantly, and she had a breakdown. And it wasn't until there was CCTV evidence to prove that obviously there was a man. And in the UK, only a male can rape with you have to have a penis. It's just a matter of law. But this just wasn't one case. There's been, quite a lot of cases. And then you have obviously the issues of residential care, mental health wards, where you're on a mental health section. If you're incapacitated, disabled women, lots of vulnerable women who've been subject to domestic violence, there's so many things that you can come up with. But we know that disabled women and these sort of vulnerable categories are twice as likely to be victims of sexual assaults in this type of arena, because of course they're easy pickings. And nothing is going to be done about this. It's just going to be, it's ideology over reality, because this most vulnerable class of people, who actually come from the most powerful class of people, are basically are oppressing us, and bowling over in terms of riding roughshod over all policy and practice. There was another woman who I know superficially. She had she was getting really complicated bowel surgery done at a private hospital in London, with two surgeries, two theatres full of really complicated equipment to run this very specialist bit of operation she needed.
Mm-hmm.
She was a victim of sexual violence, and she'd specifically asked for her procedure, for the interaction that she had to have female-only care. And basically what happened was a trans woman walked into the room while she was being examined for no other reason, essentially, other than to, intimidate her. It would seem that's what it would seem like. Basically what happened is that the hospital cancelled her operation just before she went in, and said that her values were not in accordance with their values.
Right.
And were it not for the intervention of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne and a load of women going and protesting outside of the hospitals, and kicking off on Twitter, etc., she probably would have died, to be honest. But she did have to have much more complicated surgery because it was delayed because of all of this.
That's right. And that got a lot of media attention, that case. And we're seeing, I mean, I had seen this in the case of the Rape Crisis Center that was run by a man, essentially, who didn't reveal that he was transgender when he applied for a job that had been designated for a woman. And these rape victims were coming in, and they were being essentially badgered and told, look, if you show any signs of being transphobic, which is basically anything these days, then they were going to put them through some kind of a weird indoctrination to convince them that it was perfectly okay to have men side by side in a rape crisis center that was meant for women. Now, again, like you said, talk about some of the most vulnerable people in the population who are now being harangued and browbeaten in this kind of Maoist style of, it's almost like the Cultural Revolution. It's absolutely insane. And look at the reaction, for example, of J.K. Rowling wanting to open a female-only rape crisis center. And the reaction that she's gotten, painting her out to be this fascist. This is where we've come to. This is the point at which we have arrived, and it is absolutely astounding.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. In fact, that guy is actually legally a male. And doesn't have a GRC. He didn't tell them that he was a male when he went for the interview, which was advertised for a woman. What he said was that women needed to reframe their trauma.
Right. Reframe their trauma. That's right.
Yeah. So you can, it gives you a visceral response when you think about it, doesn't it? You know, it's just so upsetting. So the other thing that has happened on a similar vein is that some NHS policies have now said that that women who basically complain about a male, a transgender male being next to them in a ward are basically tantamount to being racists, and should be treated as racists, as hostiles, because they're just essentially transphobic. And that if that's put down on your record, they would essentially ask you to leave and not treat you again, because you basically didn't want a bloke next to you, or your granny or whatever. And bearing in mind, what are you doing when you're in a hospital ward? You are seriously unwell. You are dying. You are, in a lot of pain. You are everything but sitting there being okay, aren't you? I mean, if you're actually in hospital, you are there for a reason, and generally it involves being a loss of dignity and often being, fairly undressed, etc. So the other thing that comes up a lot in that kind of argument is, well, okay, in this particular one I'm thinking about, which was a Scottish hospital called Arran, and it'll come to me. Basically what they said was, ask the trans woman if she's okay, and then give her a side room, because they're basically special. And this use of this third space of side rooms comes up quite a lot. But any clinician will tell you that this is a serious issue, and that they are not there for people with special feelings. They are highly, as I said before, fought after. This week you've probably seen we've got all these strikes going on in the UK, nurses and paramedics, etc. But at the same time, the NHS is advertising for a director of lived experience.
What is a director? What in the hell is a director of lived experience?
I know, it's just bollocks, isn't it? Basically,
yes.
It's just offensive. It's so offensive. So it's more just, it's the sort of thing Barry would go completely nuts over. It's just,
exactly
diversity and inclusion and all the rest of it. He would just blow his head. I could just see him doing he probably will do a whole video just on that one job description, basically.
Right.
Yeah. So, but on the other side of the fence, then putting, the kind of the woman to the side, you've then got the issue of the people having these harms on their bodies done, because essentially it's being sold as a kind of something which will improve their mental health, their mental well-being, and change their lives. And for many people, what they're now finding is, in fact, that's not what it's doing. We're being told it isn't an illness. It's not a mental health issue.
Right.
But you need to solve it by having drugs and surgery. And then you've got this long list of iatrogenic harms being caused, which are horrific. The detransitioner stories that are coming out now are genuinely horrific, seeing what has been done to their bodies. I'm sure you've probably caught some of them, but the thing that's worrying about what will happen about these detransitioners is people are talking about them taking legal action, which I hope that they do, and I hope that's possible. However, that comes down to, certainly in the UK, an issue of medical negligence is actually quite hard to prove, because we have this thing called the Bolam test, where it's a kind of, it's like a standard of practice recognized, where if a reasonable body of medical men would have done the same thing, which is a case that goes back to something like 1950s or something. Bolam via Freern, which basically says that if they would have done it, then that's okay. And this is the problem with everyone using WPATH, etc., because essentially what you've got is these high levels of cancer, DVTs, strokes, all of these exponentially increased risks happening to these young people's bodies. But because there's never not been any proper studies put in place, because they've captured all of the the research bodies, then they've kind of shot themselves in the foot. Like I said before, it's a real mess, which is kind of why I've been trying to focus in at source in terms of trying to deal with the children issue, and the adult side is complex, and that's the area where you get into tricky footing, where people have like a real mishmash of views, whether some people feel very strongly that the adults should be able to do what they want to do with their bodies, and then it has this knock-on effect on other people, the other sex classes. But for me, I'm basically just focusing on the kids, because I think that's a clearer position to argue in terms of the evidence-based practice that I believe so strongly about. and so that's why I spent all of this work getting involved in trying to help parents on schools, basically.
Well, there were two issues that jumped out at me, two that really caught my attention. One of them is the connection between autism and kids attending these clinics, claiming to have been born in the wrong body. That's the number one. And number two is the suicide statistics. Now, the suicide statistics struck me as bullshit. Again, it's just an instinct. It was just a hunch that I had. And my hunch was strengthened when I tried finding the source of these numbers. And I finally found the source of the numbers. And to say that these polls were unscientific, that these were not studies, they were questionnaires that were distributed. So all the people responding were self-selected, right?
Yeah.
So it's not scientific at all, at all. And then with the issue of autism, yesterday I was watching a video that popped up in my recommended. It was a psychiatrist who was talking about a study that had come out, I guess earlier this year maybe. And I started, like halfway through the video, I started to get a little bit antsy because he wasn't getting to the point. And he was making these connections that would have seemed very interesting, but my thing would have been to interrupt him and say, all right, fine, this is all very interesting, but why is this happening now? Why now? Why is it that we have had kids diagnosed with autism for a very long time? Autism is not a new diagnosis. But why is it that now this is happening? And why is it that so many girls in particular are on the spectrum and attending these clinics? And I still haven't found an answer to that. Is anybody even bothering to look into it?
Well, I mean, I'm really interested in the autism thing too, and I've done a few videos on autism specifically. I mean, the suicide study, you're completely right. It was based on 27 self-selected people. I mean, it's an absolute nonsense. And Michael Biggs is the study to look at if people want to see a really good smash and takedown of those suicide data. But the autism thing is fascinating, isn't it? And it's a big area of interest to me because I don't think people are looking at it in the correct way. Because what I think they're doing is they're bearing in mind this is an enormous spectrum of people. But what they're often doing is they're applying one set of knowledge, usually based on people at one side of the spectrum, and they're trying to apply it to people at the other side of the spectrum. And if you look on the internet, you'll find a lot of autism activists are even more militant than trans rights activists, actually. In terms of how much they have bought into gender identity. And similarly, so have all of the charities. And basically what they're saying is, isn't this nice that all of these autistic people have got this special gender identity and not one of them have applied any critical thinking or analysis to it?
Right.
But so what I would say is, I think that, and what I've tried to sort of highlight and I've tried to break it down because there are lots of comorbidities that run alongside autism. There are other things like alexithymia, for example.
What's that?
But it's basically an inability to process or describe emotions in the same way as other people do. And it's quite a serious issue because I deal with a lot of parents who've got children who've got rapid onset gender dysphoria. When I ask them what their children are saying about them, they usually say they're not saying much at all. They can't get through to them. And often it's not because the kids isn't necessarily wanting to. It's actually because they have autism and they have alexithymia and they don't actually have the language or the ability to talk about how it is they feel. So just kind of thinking about the autism side of it. So people with special interests in autism are really vulnerable to cults and to, they find making friends difficult. They will research things to the absolute nth degree and become subject specialists at it. They will have issues with gender and sexuality often. And they, because of the difficulty of making friends, what essentially is that they're now making friends together in the group of the new cult, and they're finding acceptance. They have sensory difficulties, so issues around binding, for example, the more male clothes for girls, not having to go down the traditionally, because of course now you're working on these traditional feminine stereotypes. No one feels fully female or male, but they especially may not want to wear makeup or girly type clothes because they will not relate in the same way that other girls are going through this pubertal adolescent process, because you've got this body dysmorphic disorders, you've got eating disorders population, who have almost been supplanted into this new trans population. And then you've also got a question whether or not trans is actually a new autism diagnosis for some of these kids, because in the highlight, sorry, did you want to say?
Interesting. No, I just never thought of that before. That's interesting.
So in the high levels of, if people are interested in this a bit more, there's a really good report actually on an organization called Transgender Trend. And they've got a really fabulous report by a woman called Jane Galloway, which is on autism. And she tells the whole tale of the UK situation. Essentially, in the population that came to the Gender Identity Service in London, there's significantly high population of autism, girls with autism. They're just absolutely blowing the budget, even though only 1% of the population has autism. And so, because there's such a long waiting list for autism diagnosis in the UK, when you look at the traits and when you hear the stories or read the stories from these young people on Reddit or whichever social media platform, they're all telling exactly the same tale. They're all this sort of classically kind of geeky kid telling the same thing, and you're just thinking, I absolutely think this kid's probably on the spectrum. And so there's that. And then there's also the issue of, social media, what that's done to this generation. B, COVID, and what happened when they were all in their bedrooms for a couple of years. Pornography, the impact of this on adolescent girls, and, this huge pressure for them to conform and have perfect bodies and have things like labiaplasties and, to shave their genitals and to basically pretend that they are these pornified versions for partners. And then you have, of course, in schools, them being taught that about porn and about anal sex and about all of this queer culture and sex positivity. And you've got the hookup cultures and anime and manga and all these different, these young people have been through a change that we've never seen before.
Right.
It's mind blowing.
Well, see, the thing is, there are people, I just want to point out, for people who are going to be listening to this on the streaming services, there are people in chat who are pointing out that their sons have never experienced this. But what we're talking about specifically now is girls. And why it is that so many girls, why girls are so susceptible to this, especially when you have a 5,300% increase. That's 5,300% increase in young women, many of whom are on the autism spectrum, attending these clinics. And you have to wonder, okay, is it internalized misogyny? Is it the pressures of the culture? Is it social media? Is it Tumblr? Because you mentioned, Isla, in a couple of your videos, how you were a tomboy. You had a shaved head and Doc Martens. I was a goth chick with the Doc Martens and with the pointy-toed boots and everything. Not a single one of my friends in the 80s was gender conforming. None of them. All the boys, ran around with the eyeliner, and people wore makeup and nobody cared, right? But nobody in that group of people ever said, I am a woman. And if you called your male gay friend she or girl or Miss Thing or something, it was a term of endearment. It wasn't a statement about them being women. And they knew they weren't women, obviously, and they were happy to be men. But for there to be this sea change now, I mean, look, I don't know about you, but when I went to see West Side Story, and I saw that they had turned the character of Anybody's into into somebody transgender, I was crushed. I mean, look, as a young woman, I idolized Anybody's. I thought that she was the coolest character. She could dance, she could fight, she could hang out with the boys. And I thought she was great. And she was such a sort of revolutionary character in musical theater to see a woman like that. And now to say, well, the reason that she behaved that way was that she was really male inside. No, she wasn't. She was a tomboy. And so tomboys are being erased. And that whole
Mm.
experience of being a tomboy, which is so valuable, was so valuable to so many of us, which taught so many of us independence, let us live outside of the groupthink, out of group stereotypes. And now, I mean, I shudder to think, what if I had been in school now? Would my teachers have pulled my parents in and told them that I was really a boy and I needed to go and get put on testosterone? It's very, very, very scary. It's very frightening.
It I think I haven't got my reading glasses on, which is why I kind of missed them, the chat.
Hmm.
Going back to the boys, in the early part of the small amount of research that we do have in the UK, the amount of boys was really tiny, and they'd been there for quite a long period of time,
Hmm.
and they have kind of got a bit lost, obviously, in this exponential rise of girls. But what we know about some of the boys is that some of them will go on to have autogynophilia.
Right.
Um,
And if you wouldn't
and
mind
that,
explaining for the people in chat who don't know what autogynephilia is.
well, I do actually have quite a few boys, parents with male children who are now identifying as female. Essentially, it is an arousal, a sexual fetish where they fetishize the idea of themselves as being female.
Right.
Um, and that is one of the biggest parts of the whole transgender, you know, arena, if you like. It is by
Mhm.
far the biggest component of it,
And
and
I've
is a
I've seen
fairly
a lot of, but I've seen trans rights activists claim that autogynephilia doesn't exist, that it's a made
yeah.
up term.
But they similarly, they don't believe, they don't believe in rapid onset gender dysphoria,
Right.
or they don't believe in biology either, though. So, you know,
You're right.
so
You're right.
yeah. um,
You know, well, I just wanted to say, by the way, that the lady who, the researcher who came up with the term rapid onset gender dysphoria is a
yeah,
woman named Laura Littman. Laura Littman used to be an associate professor at Brown University. She published her study.
yeah,
And there was a torrent of abuse and criticism, and Brown, to their great dismay, and I say this to my great dismay because Brown is one of my alma maters, decided to take the study down. And they have not stopped trying to stuff the toothpaste back in the tube ever since. They keep on trying to say, well, no, we don't actually. We are in favor of academic freedom. We believe in all that, but, and you know, when somebody says something with a but, that means forget everything that I just said, and this is what I really believe. So I understand that Laura Littman is now doing her research independently. She's formed her own organization, so she's not subject to the whims of universities and deans and public pressure and all that, which is good. Um,
Li-
but
li- um,
she, Mhm. Go ahead,
yeah, I was just going to say it's Lisa. Yeah, she
Lisa.
a
So,
lot.
yeah.
Yeah. Academics have absolutely suffered terribly in
Hmm.
this. It's so difficult for them to get their work out there. It really is.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but you can get her papers online if anyone's more interested in them.
Hmm. Hmm.
They are quite fascinating. That she put her head above the parapet, and good for her.
She did. She did. But you know, it's hard to look at all this happening and not suspect that there is a social contagion aspect to it, because we have seen social contagions before. I've seen many social contagion movements. And to see now that, again, when we get back to the issue of the connection between autism in girls and the number of how many more girls are attending these clinics, and nobody seems to be saying why now, because the answer would have to include social contagion. It would have to include social media. That has to be an element of it. And it's, I don't know, I find that talking about, especially talking about what's happening with young people, is, it is so crushing, because you cannot, I mean, you would have to have a heart of stone to listen to the stories that are told by the detransitioners and not have a twinge. I mean, I read this absurd comment today under a video where a guy was saying, well, actually, the fact is, and we know this to be true, which means that he just made it up. We know this to be true, that the reason that so many people are detransitioning is because they face so much discrimination in housing after transitioning, and they detransition because otherwise they'd end up homeless. That is preposterous. There is no evidence for that. There is no evidence for that, but this is like obviously a propaganda point that is circulating to kind of downplay the severity of the damage that these kids have had done to them. And I say have done to them because they're too young to make a decision that is that serious, that life-altering. And when you were talking before about the issue of the lawsuits, couldn't the parents make an argument that they could not give informed consent to these clinics under the circumstances that presented themselves? They were lied to about the damage that was the long-term damage done by puberty blockers. They were lied to about the long-term effects of hormones. I mean, this is something that we can see. We can study this. So wouldn't that be something that the parents could try?
Well, I think that there's two things there. We definitely need to talk about lesbian, gay, bisexual kids, because I think the majority of these will turn out to be LGB kids. And what we know is that a lot of them, this is essentially about transing the gay away. And maybe we can kind of come back to that after I answer part two of that question. Essentially, I think you're entirely right. And one of the things, because we've gone back and forth in the UK about the issue of puberty blockers and the legal cases, and they've gone all the way. And what's essentially happened now is we've had this this wonderful team led by Dr. Hilary Cass, who is trying to change the future of NHS model of care for young people in the UK. But essentially, as part of that progress, we've just gone through this consultation, which is the interim service specification. But puberty blockers are still on the table as part of a research process. Now, arguably, and I would strongly argue this is my absolutely strong belief, that children can never consent to sterility, to never being able to orgasm, to having their fertility taken away. They can never, as a child, understand what that means. And for brain development, bone thinning, osteoporosis, they can never consent. So I think you could be right that there could be an issue, but as we know, lawfare in the UK compared to the US is very different. And I mean, I'm kind of watching, for instance, what's going on with this woman, Sib Gallagher, over your neck of the woods. You've got this Irish doctor in Miami who's committing all of these heinous butchering breast removals on these children, and she advertises on TikTok. I mean, I'd be interested to see whether or not parents or people sue her in America, and whether that's easier for them to take legal action against her, because obviously your processes are very, very different to ours. So far, we have not had one single case go all the way. But what we have got is solicitors, lawyers trying to get cases together. So they're trying to get 1,000 cases to do a kind of class action.
Right.
But we don't know, how that's going to go. But what we do know is that if we go down the affirmative model and we give these kids drugs, that's a harmful approach. Whereas if we do watchful waiting, if we do the affirmative model, the majority of them will then go on to cross-sex hormones, and they will fully transition. Whereas if we do watchful waiting, most of them will desist, and they will go through puberty, and they will go into their sexed bodies and settle down. But what we're not doing is teaching kids any kind of resilience at all, to learn any coping strategies at school, and that this is an entirely normal part of puberty and adolescence and growing up. Instead, what we're doing is we're absolutely throwing the queer book at them, and we're indoctrinating them, and we're getting them from the age of 3, and we're teaching them that you can be born in the wrong body, that you can be non-binary, and we've got the whole country is in an absolute mess. Wales has totally lost its mind. So has Scotland, and in England, there was for instance, there was a case with a Christian family, a church taking the Church of England to court because they removed their child who was 3. In fact, that's where the example that I was just talking about. But arguing the gender critical position is actually incredibly complicated. And so they haven't got that far in it. We got the Welsh government completely paid up to the gender lobby. And of course, Scotland has lost its mind.
I have to tell you, Isla, I have been sitting back and I've been listening to Clive and Dennis talk about it, and I've heard Robbie talk about it, and I've heard Barry talk about it, and I've got you, a Scot, here.
Yeah.
I can tell you honestly that I have never in my life seen anything like what I am seeing happening in Scotland right now.
Yeah.
I am watching Nicola Sturgeon, and I am astonished by what is going on in Scotland. I have wondered so many times, and I've gotten about 1,000 different answers. So I'm guessing nobody has an answer to this, not really. But why Nicola Sturgeon would pick this to be the hill to die on, the political hill to die on, and not only that, but when you look at the polling in Scotland, and the Scottish public is not in favor of these changes by an overwhelming majority that in the polls that I've seen. And yet you have Nicola Sturgeon, and forget the Greens. I know they're crazy, and I know that she's being outflanked on the left and all that, but it doesn't matter. When you look at somebody like Nicola Sturgeon and you think to yourself, why in the world would this woman basically, move away from her mandate, which is Scottish independence, and instead put all of her eggs into this basket? I'm absolutely amazed by it, truly.
Well, it is in fact the same basket, because what she wants is young people. This is the only reason she's doing it. She doesn't care, really. This is about getting a new voter, because she wants shot of the old voters, because she's teetering on the 50%. And of course, she's got all of us old Generation X's holding her back. So if she gets this new lot of youngsters in who are absolutely lapping up the gender identity nonsense, then that'll take her up. And then she's hoping to be able to then push forward her independence, because that's all she wants. Nicola Sturgeon, in my mind, not that I want a whole load of Scottish people, because nationalism is if you want to get a load of hate thrown at you, just sign up for trans activism, autism activism, or Scottish nationalism, and then people start hunting you down. But basically, in my mind, it's just about independence for Nicola. But this has got. I'm beside myself for the women and children of Scotland at the moment. It is astonishing to me. It really, really is. It's desperate.
Mm-hmm. Now, you had spoken about transing the gay away, and this is one of the reasons why so many so many more gay activists are picking up the standard and saying, that's enough. This is conversion therapy. I mean, Dennis and I have been having this conversation for years now, that conversion therapy is no longer just, some religious figure standing over you and giving you, conducting an exorcism or berating you or, doing aversion therapy or something like that. Now it comes wrapped in the ribbon of be kind. It comes wrapped in the ribbon of civil rights, and it comes wrapped in the ribbon of progressive politics too. So whereas before it was entirely the domain of the hard right religious zealots and the parents who did not want a gay child, now you've got religious parents, or you've got parents who just don't want a gay child, who can say, oh, well, here's a solution. So my little boy who likes to play with dolls and likes to put on mama's makeup and her high heels, which is something that many boys do, that doesn't turn them into girls, and it doesn't even necessarily mean they're gay. It just means that they're playing and experimenting. But now you've got these parents who have a great out. Whether you're Susie Green or whether you are any of these other types of parents, you can say, oh, hooray, now I have an explanation for why my kid is behaving this way, and look, there's a whole way to medicate him out of whatever it is that he is supposed to be, that he is not. So it's terrifying. It really is.
It's almost like they've. It's almost like it's going to become extinct. Homosexuality, right. Because, of course, if you're bringing on a new generation. For instance, I saw a poster in a school the other day, and it was all about queer, trans, a million other different words, and there was no LG or B at all.
Right.
It's literally been erased from it because, of course, if you've got a gender identity, then you can't have a same-sex attraction.
Right.
Because you have, if you've got same gender attraction and you've got 110 genders, then it's just nonsense, isn't it? So basically, there will be no more gay, lesbian, bisexual people, because you will just have all of these mad genders, including, I mean, one of the things which is incredibly frustrating is it's magical thinking, I believe.
Right.
I don't have a gender identity. But one of the things which is incredibly harmful and how it kind of interacts with the mental health and the comorbidities is the opting into mental health diagnoses, which we've seen really manifested through things like TikTok, where you've now got all these children who think they've got extreme personality disorders, multiple personality disorders, tics, ASD, ADHD, and they're all identifying into these things. And now you have Autogender, which is autism as a gender identity, so you can decide to have autism. Now,
I see.
as someone who's on the spectrum, I would not wish to, if people really knew what it was like to live on another planet, where people really do not understand you, I would not wish that as something that you would just opt into. But this is the nature of the flippancy that's come along with social media, etc. It really is incredibly dangerous. But LGB kids are the ones which I'm particularly working incredibly hard with in terms of schools, because it's something where if you keep dragging the head teachers and teachers back to the issue about, so for instance, if they have a one of these clubs that they set up for children, you say, well, how do you ensure that, for instance, a tomboy lesbian or an effeminate gay young man doesn't get convinced that they are actually born in the wrong body and that they actually need to transition. And of course, they don't think about that because they're not there to build solid boundaries and make that person feel empowered to be a healthy gay man or a healthy young lesbian, because of course that's all been erased. And it's a serious issue. I mean, that's why I love working, speaking to people like Robbie and Barry, and I obviously know Dennis from Twitter, and Clive. I've watched his videos and stuff. We can't talk about this enough, really. And one of the reasons I'm recording videos is that I have this probably slightly old-fashioned old lady idea that by laying down small tracks, if you like, nuggets of other bits of information for young people to maybe stroll into, then maybe they'll find that there's another message, that could maybe, if it gives one kid hope, that there's another way, then it's been worth it, basically.
Well, one thing that I did want to bring up with you, and since you are yourself a medical person, I think that we are also forgetting, or perhaps many people are not aware of, how frequently women are misdiagnosed with conditions. So, for example, I have been misdiagnosed with the following: bipolar disorder, narcolepsy, osteoarthritis, fibromyalgia, and then there were a couple more, and what I had was cancer. And it wasn't until I went to a gastroenterologist, and he took a look at my distended abdomen and my skeletal legs and arms and my face sunken in. He took one look at me, he ordered a CT scan, and that was the end of the story, right? But none of these other doctors were sort of trained holistically to be able to look at the package and say, well, she's got all these symptoms and they're very widely varying, but my God, look at that abdomen. And it's not because she's obese, because she has a big abdomen and she's not pregnant. So could it be something in the abdomen? Maybe it's pancreatic cancer, maybe, something like that, right? But this happens a lot, I've noticed. And I used to notice all the time that women were being diagnosed with fibromyalgia at a much higher rate, which of course then resulted in prescriptions for pain pills and that sort of thing. I did a video last year about the phenomenon of Sybil, and how after the book and the movie came out, that more and more women who were going in to talk to psychiatrists about depression and anxiety related primarily to domestic issues, childbirth, miscarriages, postpartum depression, were being diagnosed with multiple personality disorder. And it was predominantly women who were being misdiagnosed with that condition, which, as we all know, is extremely rare. And a lot of psychiatrists don't even believe it exists. It's very, very controversial. So given the fact that women are always at risk for being misdiagnosed both with physical and mental ailments that they do not have and put on drugs that they don't need, it seems to me paramount that we do make that clear-cut distinction between the sexes. As you well know, our bodies are not built the same. Our physiologies are not the same.
I'm devastated that happened to you. I mean, it's so I hear so many stories like that. It's awful. I'm really sorry. I mean, this is kind of one of the things that drove me into teaching, because I trained thousands of nurses, and at the time, I think that they were incredibly good, kind, caring people, and I still believe that they are. But the problem with the way that our healthcare system is set up is it's never been holistic, right? It's always been very system orientated. So you will go and see an endocrinologist or a cardiac specialist, or it's all very one dimensional. We've never operated in a way which is holistic. And so they will literally say, you'll go and say, well, I've got this and that and the other. And they go, oh, nothing to do with me, love,
Right.
So that leads to situations like you've experienced, because undoubtedly these things are interlinked. You know, we know that autoimmune systems, you know, overlap with other things. I mean, there's some great books by Irvin Hoffman, who talked about women in asylums. You know, the kind of interesting thing about women and their mental health always being treated like they're hysterical. I mean, it's as old as the test of time, isn't it? And in many respects, I think the whole borderline personality disorder has been a bit of a get out of jail thing for some of them, just saying, you know, you're essentially hysterical, love. So here's a little label for you to go away with. Mm-hmm. But is it actually? Because actually, if you look at the symptoms, there's a lot of, certainly in terms of autism and borderline personality, actually they sit just like that with each other.
I did not know that.
Their presentation. You should have a look into it. Because in autism you can have high suicidality, you know, anxiety, depression, all sorts of different mental health problems. You know, anyway, have a little look. Similarly, I despair, and I think women have always suffered from this, and it's only going to get worse now because we've essentially become non-women. You know, our sex class is, you know, it's not just being erased; it has been erased for us. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know how that's going for you in the States at the moment in terms of language, but certainly over here with self-ID, it's pretty much a done deal.
Well, I can tell you that I know that I can't remember if it was Barry. It may have been Barry who expressed admiration for the fact that parents in this country can go to these council meetings and they can go to these PTA meetings. And in some cases, these meetings are televised. They're public. And so we can see parents who are absolutely livid at what is happening in the schools. Parents who are furious because they don't want teachers going behind their backs. And a lot of these parents have been vilified. Now, granted, a lot of these parents have not conducted themselves with great, you know, let's just say that when adults are highly agitated over their kids, sometimes the language that is used can be a little bit, you know, harsh. But the point is that this country is very, very different. I mean, we are built differently than you guys. For one thing, we do not have nationalized health care. Okay. So we don't have a system where you get an edict from on high and then that standard is implemented immediately across every hospital and in every doctor's office across the country. And as a matter of fact, there are a lot of doctors in this country that are now refusing to take Medicare. Because the allowances or the amounts that they're paid by the government are so low that a lot of them are forming these boutique practices where you pay a membership fee, which means that you get greater access to the doctor, you get more time with them, and the practices are smaller because so many of them have been consumed by larger medical conglomerates, you know. And we bitch a lot about our medical care in this country, and with good reason. It's extremely expensive. It is not uniformly accessible. If you live in a poor area, the chances that you're going to get good, decent medical treatment are not as good, let's say, as if you live somewhere else. People go into debt when they get very sick, and all of that is horrible, and we can all agree on it. However, the other side of the coin is what you guys are dealing with in the UK when you say that you have a waiting list of over 6 million people. That is something that's incomprehensible to Americans. We cannot imagine a situation where we have to wait years for an operation or we have to wait years to see a specialist, you know, so that's not comprehensible to us. So it's different in that regard with us.
It's bonkers, isn't it? I mean, there's been quite a lot of conversation and sort of light envy about your parents' school boards, where people saying, "Oh, I wish we had those, and we could all go along and have a good rant, you know." And you know, if you've seen a few of my videos, you know I like a good rant because I'm Scottish, and we are experts at a good rant, you know, when we get a bit of our blood going. But the thing is that what we've got is parents are being treated as hostiles at the moment, and they're being secretly transed by the schools. And if the parents are saying, "Look, I don't want my kids their name changed. I have parental responsibility." The kids, the schools are supporting the kids to do unenrolled deed poll changes and change their names. They're getting them secret binders from places like Mermaids. They are, in some cases, they were getting them referred with their parents' consent for gender dysphoria diagnosis. This was before, hopefully it's going to stop now with CAS getting involved. We've got them being taught all sorts of absolute, you know, grimness around pornography and this, you know, queer theory. We've got kids parents who've been reported to social services because of, you know, not agreeing to transition, and they've, despite the fact they're saying, you know, watchful waiting is the way to go. Have you looked at the CAS review? Have you looked at the evidence? The schools are just ignoring it, and they're saying we're just waiting for the government. And of course, the government are not doing anything because they're listening to all the lobby groups and they're sitting on the fence. And so, you know, parents are basically being vilified, yet similarly being treated as being transphobic, being punished. And it's the biggest thing I keep coming back to for people who are kind of not in the know about safeguarding is that if you've got a child who is getting punished for misgendering or correctly sexing, that's not fair. And some children with special educational needs, for example, will have a particular difficulty with, you know, say what you see. If you see a man, but you've got to call them a woman, you're going to have difficulty saying miss. And men bringing their fetish to work, you know, with prosthetic boobs, like the guy in Canada, he's the good example, you know, the guy with the massive prosthetic boobs, etc. You know, kids having to call him miss is the absolute epitome of gaslighting. And the thing is, one of the things which we argue a lot about is when adults are saying, well, for my trans friends, I will call them she or he. And I understand their arguments for that. But what I would say back to them is that because as adults we have a responsibility to role model for children, we also have to think about the most vulnerable people. And so if women in prison, for instance, are getting time added to their sentences if they misgender, and if children are being punished because if they misgender, then surely we need to act as a team on their behalf for the most vulnerable. So not think about our privilege, but think at all times about the worst off. And that's how I apply my thinking in the way I work. And I know that a lot of people, you know, that's controversial and a lot of people would have a real go at me over that, but that's essentially where how I come at it.
Listen, I am still astonished that all the bullshit that I was forced to learn in college in the 80s, okay? But I was in a liberal arts program. I was an English lit major. And so the infection of post-structuralism and postmodernism had already entered through the English departments, and then it spread to the sociology departments, and it stayed in the liberal arts field, okay? But the fact that it is finally spread into STEM and into the medical profession, to me, is probably one of the most terrifying developments I can imagine. I mean, look, I bitch and moan all the time about how I don't feel that I was properly educated in school, certainly not for what my parents paid for me to study. But, you know, you can always make up for that later. I mean, it's only books. You know, you can always go back and you can read the classics on your own, and you can watch lectures on YouTube now from very interesting people. But when it comes to medicine, that is a totally different thing. That is talking about life and death. That is a question of who gets treated, who doesn't get treated, who gets put in the front of the line, who gets put in the back of the line, who gets raped in a single sex ward. And so now it's no longer fun and games. Now it's no longer a question of feeling like you didn't get what you paid for. Now it's a question of actual physical and mental safety. And that, I think, is probably one of the most terrifying. I mean, aside from children being experimented on, this business of having doctors co-signing this, pushing this, health professionals pushing this, and the patients are left to either suck it up and take it, or do what exactly? What are you supposed to do if you don't have the money to go for private care or leave the country to get treatment? Then what the hell are you supposed to do? You're trapped. It's terrifying.
Did you? There was a couple of cases in Danish detransitioners who had voluntary euthanasia because
Yeah.
they were unhappy with their the results of their transition. And one of them made a documentary which is available. I can't remember how I found it. It was subtitled. You had to pay a small amount for it. It's one of the saddest, most devastating things I've ever watched. I cried my eyes out for this woman who basically had her life. She gave up her life because of the abomination that had been committed on her body, and because she couldn't deal with the mental distress of the torture that was left in her mind. And yeah, I care very much about people's mental health and their well-being, and I can't deal with suffering one way, whoever they are. And I do believe, I do care about people who call themselves trans people, even though I don't believe in transgenderism. I believe in men, women, girls and boys. But I do care that people feel mental distress. I do care that they but I think I like, as someone with the kind of academic background, I like to take a step back and look at the bigger picture of what's going on. And I have a lot of questions about what they're being fed, how it's being fed to them. And I don't accept a lot of the narratives. I don't accept a lot of the organizations that are peddling a lot of the things, like WPATH, for instance. Like, I don't believe that eunuchs are a thing. They that they're a gender identity. I believe that people are being butchered. So sometimes I think we're one step forward and then we're many steps back. But there's a lot of distressed people caught up in this. That is for sure. But yeah,
Your friend, the lady who wrote "Born in the Right Body."
Yes.
Now
She's
I
awesome.
heard your interview. I heard your interview with her, and she was talking because apparently she's a psychiatrist, and she was talking
She is, yeah.
about cases of people, of detransitioners or people who had gone through transition, who have come to her expressing very, very serious suicidal ideations because what they expected to happen after the surgery is not what ended up happening. So, are you aware of any studies, any stats, or anything like that on people who have gone through the transition and who then end up worse off, or who end up, with serious, who end up having suicidal ideations, or God forbid committing suicide? Has anybody done any looking into that issue?
There is. I think she probably did talk about mental health outcomes not actually changing, and that people still being incredibly unhappy. And in fact, it didn't present them with the solutions that they thought it would. In fact, I just put out a detransitioner video today. And for a lot of them, I think that they are sold it like it's going to be a new beginning, and it's something that they can run away from. And it's almost, particularly for young people who feel bad about their lives, because of course a lot of them have been abused. They're from looked after care. They're from very difficult social backgrounds. They might have had a parental death or a whole host of different issues. So it's the idea of reinventing yourself is hugely enticing. But the studies that have been done, and of remembering that they have been hampered hugely by everything that we've talked about before, have shown that actually outcomes are not improved, and that people still feel bad, and they still have suicidal ideation. If not, for some of them, it's worse, because now they have these medical harms, because you've got fistulas, incontinence, nerve damage, stomas, untold, these voids. I'm not going to call them vaginas, because they're not vaginas. They're, voids from colonplasties or inverted penises with untold medical problems, etc. And so it goes on. So they're still suffering from, and then of course, are they going to be accepted? I mean, an interesting way of looking at this is on the other side of the fence. Because I do a lot of research because of the school's work, if you look at some porn channels, you'll find that a lot of porn settings, you'll have like 1,000 or so videos in a genre. But if you look at trans porn, on the one that I looked at when I was having a look for this information, it had 42,000 videos just on trans porn. That's in the last year. That's just gone like that, whoosh. So there's a lot of people, probably a lot of straight men, looking at trans porn, I would surmise. It is taken off, and I think there is, where people finding acceptance, if in the general population, you mentioned earlier about how fitting into communities, etc. I'm not sure that I think the rest of the population, certainly over here, are actually still too scared to speak out on it, because they don't want to get cancelled or lose their jobs, because that's a major threat. But I think they are finding acceptance within this queer thing that they've formed, this rainbow thing, mafia, if you like. But I think the rest of the population is still keeping their head down, and there's very few people who are like doing this, like we're doing now, putting your head above the parapet and talking on it. This is, it's quite a big thing.
Well, look, I was too afraid to speak out on this subject for a long time, and I started sort of tinkering around the edges last year. I floated some trial balloons, and when it came to this year, I decided I didn't care anymore, because I thought that we had reached a stage of red alert that was too serious and too evident to ignore anymore. And I understand completely why people are so afraid to say anything. I get it. People have seen outspoken individuals lose their jobs, mostly women, lose their jobs, get their houses picketed, threatened, rape threats, beaten up, assaulted. They've seen what has happened, and they don't want to be branded as bigots, as some kind of a phobe. Nobody wants to be branded that. That's terrible. What a scarlet letter in society. But I've decided, and I think a number of other people have decided now as well, that it doesn't matter if you brand those of us who think this way with some kind of an epithet, if you hurl epithets at us, if you call us something that we're not. What matters is that there is a wave of medical malpractice that has swept around the world that has harmed children and has harmed a lot of extremely, extremely vulnerable people. Everything from kids going through the surgery, getting medicated, having to be on medication for the rest of their lives, to women in the wards, to gay people, to women in prison. And I'm really, really glad you brought that example up, because you may know that there's a class action lawsuit in California now where there are female prisoners who are suing the governor of California. And it's exactly what you were saying. You know, if a woman comes forward to the warden or to a guard and says, hey, what is this? There's a man here. And they're told, no, there isn't. And if you say that again, then we're going to add time to your sentence, or we're going to discipline you, we're going to punish you. So not only are you being gaslighted, but you're being gaslighted behind bars, and you're being locked up with a dangerous predator, or several even. And people will say to me, well, but there are already male guards in the prisons, and maybe they're taking advantage of these women. Well, then the solution is to put rapists, murderers, and child molesters in with these women.
Yeah.
So so you think that this is a good solution to that problem. So anyway, it's very frightening, and I know that I certainly consider myself to be one of these types of people. I get extremely irritable and upset when somebody tries to gaslight me, and it happens all the time. But with regards to this subject, you know, there's a tremendous amount of liberty in breaking out of these chains and saying, you know what, I'll be the little kid and the emperor has no clothes. I'll be that person. And then eventually maybe if I say something, then somebody else will and somebody else will. And then we can open up the conversation and we can see things for what they really are and how they really are. But right now, there are too many people who are too afraid because this movement has taken over too many important institutions. And it is really, really terrifying.
Well, I mean, it might surprise you to know that even within the movement that you know I'm working in, I would be known as an extremist, and because so yeah, it's never ending, but I don't care. You know, I'm just a truth teller, really.
Right.
And I think one of the benefits of being a menopausal woman, and it's a gift that you get given, I think, when you hit your 50s, is just a whole load of I literally don't care anymore. Present.
Exactly.
Like, I don't give a shit. I honestly have no filter now. I mean, obviously, I've been on my best behavior today, but you know, I genuinely don't care. I'm just going to tell it like it is now, and that's the way it is, and that's the benefit. Yep. That's what we do get, which is good about being middle-aged.
I swear to God, Isla, I have said this to my chat so many times. I've said this on Twitter. I've told people in my circle this. There is something magical about being a woman and reaching your 50s. It is the most amazing thing. And then I had a hysterectomy when I was 48. So I went through menopause 9 years ago. And it has been so liberating to be both in my 50s and having gone through menopause. It is amazing because it really does free you. It is not a rumor. It is not just, you know, something that we throw around. It's true. It is a thing. So for all of you out there, all of you women out there who are like, oh my God, I don't want to go through menopause. I don't want to go through the change. I don't want to get old. It is a blessing. Trust me. And listen, now I've got backup from Isla. She can say that I'm right.
Oh no, it's it's just got to be done, really. I mean, what I'm trying to do I mean, I'm a kind of unlikely YouTuber, really. You know, I'm literally just doing it to try and reach parents and sow a few seeds. It's actually really difficult to build up numbers because obviously it's not as sexy. And the funny thing is about having the boys on, and I absolutely love them dearly.
Me too.
But obviously they can talk the hind legs off a donkey.
True.
And so I always, you know, obviously talk a lot less when I've got them there. And people absolutely love them, and that's great. And we have a lot of fun. And it's really, you know, we're all helping to get the message out to parents. Right. And the more we build it up on YouTube, the more parents out in the world will find the issues and go, oh, okay, I'm not alone in being worried about this. There are people talking on it. So it's it's really powerful. So yeah, great, you know. And if anyone wants to follow up me or hit me up on YouTube or Twitter and needs help or wants to chat, I'm always available. Yeah.
All of Isla's socials are listed in the description box. So her YouTube channel and her Twitter are in the description box. Please, please do go follow her and do watch her content. Isla's content is so good. I'm warning you though, don't let this calm demeanor fool you, because Isla is a very passionate woman.
If I get annoyed, I'm off.
and her content is infuriating, but the way that she presents it is amazing, and you're going to learn a lot from Isla, and you're going to learn a lot from her guests too. So please do. Well, Isla, I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Thank you so much for coming on today.
I've really enjoyed it. It's really nice to meet you and talk to you.
You too.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
all right,
Isla.
Care. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
All right, you guys, thank you so much. Please do subscribe to Isla. She is absolutely amazing. You will love her content. You will love it. All right, guys, thank you so much for being here. I hope that you all enjoyed it. I hope you all learned something today, and we will see you the next time. See you later.